All right, let's get started. Let's go over my expectations for written paper number 4, Symbolism of the Volsungs. So let me read the prompt. After reading chapter 18 concerning the slaying of Fafnir from the saga of the Volsungs, identify a symbol or motif presented in the text that reflects the patterns from this Icelandic culture of Vikings, elves, and dragons. Describe its meaning and value it has on the story. So a couple of points. One is that you don't have to just read about chapter 18. 18 is the one that I'm going to focus on because there's a lot of great symbols to come across. But you're free to use any part of the saga of the Volsungs, which I have many chapters on Google Classroom. Also, you just need to pick one symbol or motif to focus on, and its meaning and value is reflected upon the story. So you're looking at how the symbol and motif is reflected in the story, what impact it has on the story as a whole. And that will come through as part of their culture and maybe some additional information about, like, maybe Odin or what it means to be a kind of warrior in the culture, but it's mostly based upon the story that you're looking for. Rating wise, some points that differ from the other written paper is this is going to be about 400 words. So we're trying to get it in at a smaller degree. Also, no citations needed, no in-text citations. We do have to do a works cited page, but we'll go over that later. And then the usual clear thesis, and make sure that in your paragraph, not only do you have supporting evidence, critical analysis, but also that transitional sentences. We're focusing on getting better at this as we continue throughout the year. Okay, so here are the 5 things that I'm going to focus on mostly. You can pick another, but this is one I will talk about most. So it would be wise to pick something within this category. So we have ancestry, dragon, fate, a sword, and a warrior. Next is, what is the difference between a theme, motif, and symbol? Visually, if you look at it like this, you can kind of see where motif comes in the middle and why there is a distinction between it, but sometimes it's difficult to really see the difference between maybe a motif and a symbol. So I'm going to go over that. First is the motif is more of a concept. So not just a repeating pattern, but also something that's a little more deeper in its meaning and requires you to maybe use different parts of a chapter or different chapters altogether. And yet, it's not a theme that's used throughout most of the story. It's not the big picture. It's something that just has like a stepping stone to it. And symbol is something that's a little more tangible, a little more of an object or image. So this can fall under something like a color or like the sword, right? The particular sword that Sigurd uses, and focusing on the meaning that has in its story. Let's go over motif and theme. So again, the abstract ideas that you're trying to connect and convey here with a motif is something that's important to the story, but not something that is going to be seen throughout all the chapters. So, for instance, if you're going to talk about Fafnir the dragon, it's not like a dragon in every chapter. It's not like the dragon is the biggest theme of the whole book. It just makes up a section of the saga, and so even though it's an important part, it could still work as a motif because there's more to talk about, but it doesn't encompass all the chapters. Notice that point out I have a line drawn here. It divides the difference between motif and theme and motif and symbol, and yet I have part in bold the term of abstract between both of them. And that's because a lot of these concepts, they're not always so clean. Sometimes they overlap and there's some gradient involved. So, as we work through the first draft, I'll correct on that term. One of the main points too is also prose versus poetry. In a prose, which is the common language, a novel, the saga of the Volsungs is told in a prose format, so it's very matter of fact. Sigurd picks up the sword, he stabs the dragon dies, things like that. Poetry, on the other hand, normally is very short and has stanzas and has a lot more symbolism in it just by its own nature. So a lot of times when you're talking about symbolism in a poetry, there's not much of a need per se to talk about a motif because you've already talked about all the deep stuff. And so sometimes, and the theme that might just be in the title. So there's not even a whole lot maybe to really engage with the theme of a poem because it's just like maybe it's about spring and you're just all the poem just talking about springtime. Another thing to keep in mind too is the Saga of the Volsungs comes from poetry, a lot of it. So it will have some poetic moments in it, which helps with the symbolism, but it still can differentiate between that and a motif. Here's a picture of Odin. I'm going to talk about those pictures too towards the end because there's a reason why I chose this art from the late 1800s to early 1900s. Also, I wrote down a couple of comparisons here. So when you're thinking about your concept, because we're going to connect this paper, you're going to use someone else's to talk about a symbol in Dune Part 2 of the movie that's going to come out. So in doing that, you can see how there are things that connect. For instance, when you talk about fate, fate's very prevalent throughout the Saga of the Volsungs because of Death Day and the the language used. But in Dune, they may not use the term fate per se, but there is the Imperium, there's the Emperor who has given this decree to House Atreides, and it's not so simple that they can just refuse it. So there's a lot of external factors that play into that role. So you can connect between the fate of the Saga of the Volsungs with how sort of fate works in Dune. So this is something to get you thinking about which symbol or motif you want to focus on in the Saga of the Volsungs. So here's the big cautionary one. Um, so one of the big things that happened in the late 1800s, early 1900s or so, there was this big Viking revival to learn about Viking culture and reflect upon it. There's operas made and stories. The problem is, even though there's different versions between Germanic and Nordic and picking between them, there's still not a lot of actual written work. There's not like dozens upon dozens of sagas. It's very limited. And the information in the sagas isn't always as clear. And so it goes back to older texts. But after that, there's this huge oral tradition, and a lot has been lost. So to be cautioned when you're doing research, because this Viking revival caused a lot of artists to pull from different sources like Roman culture or ancient Greek. Sometimes the Norns, who represent fate, they're depicted almost like the fates in ancient Greek culture and like they're sisters. But in the original Nordic, they're just mentioned as women. They may not be sisters at all. It's quite different. So this is kind of happens over time that cultures later go back and, artists use inspiration all the time. But when you're doing your own research, I have some videos here to give you a very direct result of things. So here with Jackson Crawford is the translator of the text we're using from, and he has a YouTube channel. He's got a lot of great sources. So here is the entire Saga of the Volsung, and most of his videos are under 10 minutes. Each of the different parts, and he gives a little rundown. And he doesn't give you a lot of analysis, but there are some comments he makes that do demonstrate some motifs and things that you can pull from. So this would be really great. Part 3 is the particular text that we're doing, chapter 18. And you may want to see the video before it or even after it to get a sense of context. So here are these videos. Also, I have a bunch of videos of his explanation of things. There's the Havmar, which is Havamal is this big Nordic paint bunch of poetry separated into a bunch of sections. it comes from the perspective of Odin, so it's as if Odin is like sitting next to you at a campfire and giving you these pearls of wisdom. So that video is longer because it's many sections, but it's good about overall culture. And then I have a bunch of other videos here that break down some of the concepts that I've already going to talk about. So this is a good way to do a little bit of research, but not have to spend as much time, learning about the culture as a whole. But overall, you can use these videos to then understand the story a little bit clearer without having to, read through the whole saga of the Volsungs multiple times. Also, the art here that I've chosen, this is art from the late 1800s. So you can see that this is kind of our own picture of this Viking culture, but it comes at a time much later. It doesn't necessarily represent very accurate to the stories per se, but it is very romantic. This picture over here on page 5, this is Sigmund, Sigurd's father. This is when he's older and he's fallen in battle. And if you'll see upon his chest, this is his sword. His sword was broken in two at the end of this battle. Um, and so you can see a little bit of symbolism just in this own image of how he's broken and the sword's broken. And then, Sigurd restores the sword to one piece and then goes and get revenge for his father. So that's a concept there. And then, yeah, more videos. So here's the works cited. I already have a way for you to talk about no author with translator, which is what we're pulling from. And then if you want to do some of the clips and videos, you can post those in the works cited. Now, with works cited, you don't have to have any in-text citations to have a bunch of works cited. Sometimes works cited pages and information is it just shows information that you've gathered. Just I've looked at this person and their book and some of the stuff from it, and you got some of their ideas. And you don't have to say where you got all their ideas necessarily in your paper, but it's clear when you're talking about the history or some sort of symbolism. If someone were to look at it and look down at your works cited, they would see that, oh, you're pulling probably from here or there. So it gives them a source to validate your research. After this, I have the usual stuff in here from the other written papers I've consolidated. Everyone's doing pretty well at this. We've gotten a lot better at how to form a thesis. We're doing a topic sentence, which is a more expanded view of the claims sentence we've been working with. The big one here is transitional sentence. So keep these in mind. I have the symbol over here of the Midgard serpent, and he represents a sense of circular motion. And that's what you want to think about when you do transitional sentences. You want to think about the flow of your paper of not just starting and ending in places, but continuing from one sentence to the next, from one paragraph to the other paragraph, and even leaving your paper with the audience of maybe interested in starting again at the beginning of your paper and reading through it again. So there's a sense of circular motion with the flow, and that's what a transitional sentence gives you. And here's the overall structure with the bodies that we've gone over. And last but not least is the rubric for grading. Just make sure that you have support. And so again, support's going to come from your logic rather than necessarily an in-text citation. It's going to come from your interpretation and how, when you're looking at it, how you think that this has a reflection upon the story and the symbol. And that's okay to come away with your own sense of interpretation and options. It's good to have a strong voice, but at the same time, when you're going for deeper meaning, it's okay to also, talk about this being your opinion or based on this text, this is the conclusion you reach, things like that. And yeah, so here is the artwork that the other guy did. So that's all I have for here. And if you have any questions, let me know.